Good morning, church family. It's delightful to be back with you all this Sunday morning. Last Sunday I wasn't here because my family, we took a nice little weekend break starting on the 31st to get away, spend a little bit of time in a more rural setting than this, to get our nature fix that we had been kind of missing, and also, to be honest with you, strategically to avoid the trick-or-treaters. While I was working last week, because of the fact that I wasn't preaching, I had more time on my hands to do some intentional self-care. And so one of the things that I did is I signed up for a virtual pastors conference. And it was Thursday of that week that I was sitting there watching a live stream on my laptop while my two kids were doing their live streams for their classrooms on their laptops, and we were all kind of like doing our thing. And my son's class ended early, and so he walked over and he saw that I was doing class, and he crawled up into my lap, and he kind of became really interested in what this gentleman was saying. It was this dynamic speaker, speaking to a national audience. And I just really enjoyed that moment of holding him close, and we're both getting truth from this preacher. When it was over, I said, "Wow, that guy was really good, wasn't he, buddy?" And Jansen said, "Yeah, he's better than you." So, it's good to be humble. Everything's relative, kid. Today we are in week 5 actually, of our sermon series, going through the book of Hebrews, which is all about the supremacy of Christ. It's like my favorite thing to talk about. Last week, Raymond, our youth director, did a great job describing how Jesus was superior to, or better than, if you prefer, Moses. This week we're going to look at how Jesus is superior to all of Israel's historical priests as well, and how he was and how he is uniquely qualified to represent mankind before God the Father. Last week, the author of Hebrews argued that since Jesus is superior to Moses, we have a superior responsibility to be faithful, even more so than the Israelites of Moses' day. They failed to enter God's rest in the promised land, and we are wise to learn from their mistakes, especially since we have even more at stake based on our belief or unbelief. Raymond also discussed how Christianity is, at its most basic, a confession. The text from Hebrews 3:1, his opening verse, said, "Consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession." Thereafter in the text, the author used the word faith in place of confession, and therefore we are to view them as interchangeable. After all, as Raymond pointed out, Paul's epistle to the Romans in chapter 10, verses 9 and 10, tells us this: "If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." There's a period at the end of that sentence. "For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved." Therefore, remaining faithful to the truth of who Jesus was and is, and all the work that he'd done on your behalf, our behalf, is the particular form of faith that the author is both assuming that his audience has and is imploring them to cling to, as we're about to see for many good reasons. Keep in mind, the first verse of today's passage is a linkage verse, in that it both closes up the thoughts from last week while at the same time introducing a new direction in the overall argument. So with that, let's go to the text. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession." The words "hold fast" present another important and recurring concept for this author, and they're found together 4 different times throughout this book. That combination of words could make a very suitable candidate as a subtitle for a sermon series going through the book of Hebrews. Hebrews, hold fast. At minimum, they mean keep the faith. And that is one of, if not the primary goals in this exposition. Remember that he assumes his audience is made up of believers. While that's true, he also recognizes that apostasy, or walking away, trusting in other things, is not only a lingering threat to this church, it's a growing threat. And specifically because the church has been enduring an increasing amount of persecution from the culture that they're surrounded by. Does that sound familiar? At this point, I'd also like to mention, as Raymond did last week, that it's not their eternal salvation that the author is primarily concerned about, but rather it's the fruitfulness of their walk in life and their inheritance in God's rest, their eternal rest. As biblical scholar Thomas Constable put it, quote, notice that this verse does not say that since we have such a high great priest, we will inevitably hold fast our confession. Perseverance in faith and good works is not inevitable, though perseverance in salvation is. That should be both comforting and challenging to us. He continues by saying, since we have such a high priest, we must be careful to hold fast our confession. This verse concludes the exhortation to enter into his rest that Raymond was basically talking about last week. So now we move on to verses 15 and 16, which close out chapter 4. Verse 15 reads, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. 2 weeks ago, I preached through chapter 2 of this book, which closed with a 2-verse preview of this concept of Jesus as the great high priest, and of which I just spent a few short minutes addressing. Today's passage gives us more detail. It fills in this beautiful idea and enriches us all the more with some additional insights. We spoke previously about how Jesus was tempted in every way, which is what allows him to be legitimately sympathetic to us and our personal temptations. At first glance, a modern skeptic might raise an eyebrow at this concept. After all, the world is a vastly different place than Palestine 2,000 years ago, right? Jesus never had to deal with some of the temptations that we have. We've got an incredible temptation machine in our home, your discontentment box, or you've got one in your hand. Jesus never had to worry about that instant gratification temptation. Jesus never had to worry about getting an epinephrine hit in his brain because he got all those likes on his social media account or something else equally shallow. He never had some of the other more insidious things directly in front of him. However, as a fully human being, he was tempted in every area of his life, including the desire to waste time, to seek out affirmation in hollow ways, and to step out of his Father's will to avoid pain. But he never did. Not once. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Great is thy faithfulness. Wow. You see, the temptations don't actually change. It's just the means by which with we are tempted. As we read in Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. Okay? So the takeaway for you in this regard is that while Jesus may not have walked through every particular circumstance that you have experienced in your life or you're experiencing right now, He has walked through every circumstance in terms of the underlying principles and the pain in the heart. And therefore, he truly does understand whatever you have faced or are facing. You can and you should take great comfort in this. Now, verse 16 is one of the sweetest exhortations in all of Scripture, in my humble opinion. Again, it reads, "Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." So to fully appreciate this, it's appropriate to consider the incredible danger of entering into the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, or later the temple, in any way other than what was explicitly prescribed within the Mosaic law. The Holy of Holies, which housed the Ark of the Covenant and housed the Ten Commandments, was behind a curtain that represented the separation between the holy and the unholy. Going beyond that curtain was a task only for one man, appointed as the high priest to do only once a year, on the Day of Atonement. The high priest had a very strict process to go through to make sure that he was temporarily clean enough to offer the annual sacrifices on behalf of the nation. They would wear long ropes around their waists in case they were struck down by God by dropping the proverbial ball. The idea being that our high priest has been struck down. We don't want to go in and get him. But if that happens, we'll drag him out by a rope. A thrice holy God. It was a terrible and awesome responsibility to draw near to the judgment throne of God. However, since Jesus, on the cross, made the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of faithful mankind, the veil in the temple was torn from top to bottom. There is no separation. This not only gives his followers unfettered access to God the Father, but as we see right here, it's an actual encouragement to come into my presence, expecting not wrath, but an embrace. That's amazing. We can expect mercy and grace from the Father when we express trust in the gift of his Son. We can expect grace and mercy from the Father when we express trust in the gift of his Son. Now, this past verse also speaks to things being in a time of great need. I think that ever since I've arrived here, we've been in a time of great need. It was a time of great need before COVID. It was a time of great need before this election. And it will continue to be a time of great need for quite some time, no doubt. We need the mercy of God big time. Lord, at this time, I just would ask you to please heal our broken land. We ask you to preserve what is good about it and to remove that which is not pleasing to you. And there's a lot. Would you encourage us as individuals and as a church to be a part of the solution and not just silent bystanders, or worse, those who contribute to the problems? Please, God, forgive and bless America in spite of our great sins. Amen. Verses 15 and 16 also further preview what will be broken down in the next 10 verses. And they were written in a beautiful mirror-like pattern In a masterful touch of argumentation and literary work, the author organized the next section in an ABC CBA pattern that looks like this. You can see that he first is going to talk about the old office of the high priest. Then he'll talk about the solidarity of the historic high priest with the people and the humility of the high priest historically. And then in comparison that, in like a mirror image, the humility of Christ, the solidarity of Christ with the people, and in contrast to the old office of the priest, it's the new office of the high priest. And that's pretty cool if you like that kind of thing. I get a kick out of it. But more practically speaking, this really helps us appreciate the point that the author is trying to make, right? Jesus is the one who fulfilled the law. Jesus is the high priest, the one who had it right, the one who did it in every way that was intended. He's the mirror image. So now let's unpack these final 10 verses, one idea at a time, starting in 5:1. 5:1 says, "For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins." This is a context-providing reminder of the way that one got the office itself, and that they were chosen by God from among the line of Levi, and more specifically of Aaron within the Levites, by birth to serve God. Chosen before birth. Uniquely out of all the tribes of Israel, the Levites were the only ones who were not given a land inheritance in the promised land, because their inheritance was to be God himself, serving God, being in his presence, having that great honor of bringing people into his presence, working alongside of him. They had a set-apart role to work on behalf of their brethren in making sacrifices for the temporary covering of their sins. Verse 2 says, "He can deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness." Now, of course, we're talking about the historical priests here, right? Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. So as we said before, the priest had to be fully human to be a true representative of humanity. Jesus' solidarity with us was and is based on his experiences of living like us, among us, for 33 years, and his faithful endurance to living out God's will. As William Barclay said, quote, "The best person to give you advice and to help you on a journey is someone who has traveled the road before you. The best person to help you through an illness is someone who has come through it," end quote. Now let's turn to verse 4, which describes the humility of the high priest. It says, "And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was." You see, there was no popular election to be the high priest. It was seen as something that one either had the calling for or they did not. And accepting the call was, given that incredible responsibility, itself an act that would make anyone humble. So again, we just saw in the last 4 verses a strategic discussion of the old office of the high priest, the old priest's solidarity with the people, and the humility of the high priest. And now over the last 6 verses, we're going to see respectively the humility of Christ, the solidarity of Christ with us, his people, and the new office of the truly high priest presented. Verse 5 says, "So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.' As he says also in another place, 'You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek.'" So here the author of Hebrews is again quoting from the Old Testament, and he really seems to love Psalms, and he really seems to love Psalm 2 and Psalm 110. In the first quote, we see Jesus' legitimacy to be our high priest in heaven established through his divine sonship. The second quote argues for the legitimacy of him as our earthly priest, despite not being a Levite, which is what the Hebrew audience would have been looking for. He, as we discussed this summer in reviewing Psalm 110, and we'll address again in a few weeks when we get to Hebrews 7, was instead a priest in the model of Melchizedek. So the primary theme of this book is Jesus' supremacy over the angels, over Moses, in this case, over the historic priesthood. And then we'll see how he is also superior over the entire Old Covenant as the one who ushered in the New Covenant. Just like last week, in which Raymond pointed out that the author in no way minimized or dishonored Moses. It's an important point here. But rather acknowledged his contributions while simultaneously arguing for Jesus' supremacy over even such a great servant as Moses. Here, over these preceding 6 verses, the author is not in any way denigrating the office of the priesthood, but rather they're showing significant appreciation for the office and for those who faithfully filled it, while, again, simultaneously arguing for Jesus' supremacy over all the preceding priests, starting with Israel's first, Moses' very brother Aaron, the Levite. So look with me now at verse 7. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Excuse me for a second. Verse 7 is just dense with good stuff. Intense imagery of Jesus crying out to God. And it's also full of encouraging truth. In order to fully appreciate Hebrews 5:7, let's pause for a second. If you got your Bible with you, we'll flip to Matthew, or we'll have the entire passage I'm about to read up on the screen as well. We're just going to pivot for a second to Matthew. It's Matthew 26, verses 36 through 44. It reads, "Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I go over there and pray.' And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, 'My soul is very sorrowful, even to death.'" So yes, Jesus can sympathize with you. "Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So, could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the 3rd time, saying the same words again. So what can we glean from this narrative to help us better understand Hebrews 5:7? First of all, I want to share with you the meaning of the word Gethsemane. The Garden of Gethsemane is located on the Mount of Olives. And it means olive press. You see, olives were fruit provided by God to provide nourishment and sustenance to mankind. And they were very abundant in that area. But in order to gain from olives, besides directly consuming them yourself, and crushing them with your teeth. You just need to crush them in large batches at an olive press. Once a large batch of olives is essentially totally destroyed, all that's left is the precious oil. Oil which would provide sustenance and light to a dark and hungry world. So as Jesus fell on his face and he's literally crying and he's sweating blood, he knows he's about to be crushed for our iniquities. And that soon his blood would pour out, just like the oil of an olive, to provide light and sustenance for a dark and hungry world. It's awesome. Now, the Hebrews text here in 5:7 not only says that Jesus cried out to God, but that he was heard because of his reverence. The Matthew account adds to this by suggesting that he wasn't just reverent, but he was also very persistent, praying the same thing over and over again. May we be a people of reverent and persistent prayer, even if it means we are crying out and people look at us strange. Now, before I move on, I just want to clarify that the author here, in saying, quote, to him who was able to save him from death, end quote, was not suggesting that Jesus' death on the cross was something that he or the Father actually intended to avoid, and that since he did die, somehow this prayer was not answered, which is abundantly clear in at least a dozen other texts. But rather, that God the Father had the ability to, and did, raise him up post-death, thereby nullifying the power of death, which in some is saving him from death. It was always the intention. It was the Father's will to crush him for us. And Jesus said that I go with joy. Now, we're getting down to the last 3 verses of the passage for today. And at the end, we're going to be saying a prayer together. So, we're now in verses 8 through 10. And they read, although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Again, in these verses, come on up, guys, we get a succinct view of some of this book's main themes that we previously examined. The bottom line here is that Jesus is the ultimate and the final high priest necessary to represent mankind before a thrice holy God. And as such, he both, think about this, just close your eyes for a minute. He constantly intercedes on our behalf, on my behalf, on your behalf, in times of trouble, such as now. And he also modeled for us how to live, including how to pray. At the same time, as God's Son, he is also uniquely qualified to do this for us, not down here amongst the fray of the earth, but in heaven. Our encouragement to you today is to lift your eyes out of our national fray, out of our international fray, and up to the things that are unchanging, that are constant, that are true, that are encouraging, that are your inheritance, that you will experience in abundant joy forever and ever. And let the things of this world fade away. And therefore, it seems fitting to close by praying as Jesus himself taught us. So, recite with me now the Lord's Prayer, which is found in Matthew 6, 9 through 13, and which, for old time's sake, as this is how I memorized it, and probably many of you probably memorized it, we're going to put this up in the King James Version. Read with me. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.